Psachim, Perek Hey Mishnah Aleph. Tamid nishchat b'shmoino mechza v'karev b'teisha mechza, v'arvei psachim nishchat b'shevo mechza v'karev b'shmoino mechza. The Mishnah is going to begin to discuss the halachas of the Korban Pesach. As we mentioned, that everyone is mechuyev to bring a Korban Pesach in the afternoon of Erev Pesach and eat it that night. A person doesn't usually bring this Korban on his own, rather as a chabura, and they eat the meat of the Korban Pesach together. It's the Mishnah start by describing the procedure for shechting the korban on the afternoon of Erev Pesach. So as we all know, there's a mitzvah in the Torah to bring two korbanos tamid that were brought in the Beis Hamikdash, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, tamid shal shachar and tamid shal bein ha'arbayim. Many other korbanos were brought throughout the day, and as a rule, they all had to be brought between the two korbanos of the tamid. No korban could be brought before the tamid shal shachar, and no korban could be brought after the tamid shal bein ha'arbayim. An exception to this was the Korban Pesach, which was brought on Erev Pesach after the Tam Shal Bein Arbaim. Because it is, the Tam Shal Bein Arbaim had to be brought earlier than usual to allow the time for the Korban Pesach. So the Mishnah is going to teach that when the Tamid was brought every day and when it was brought on Erev Pesach, because there was a difference in the time, they changed the schedule, so to speak. So the Korban Tam Shal Bein Arbaim was shechted on an ordinary day at 8.5 hours after sunrise. So without getting into the complex discussions about this, but we're talking about Shais Maniyos. We're not talking about an hour of 60 minutes, but each one would be 2.5 hours after Chatzos. B'chlal, throughout the Mishnayos, whenever we talk about an hour, we talk about Shais Maniyos, seasonal hours. Each Shah is a 12th of the day, no matter how long the day is. But Arvei Psachim, so Tamid Nishchat B'shmoino Mechza v'Kar b'Teisha Mechza. So the Tamid was brought, they were makrav, they shechted it at 8.5 hours, and they burnt it on the Mizbeach at 9.5 hours. The process of bringing the Tamid, which began with the Shechita and ended by being burnt on the Mizbeach, took up to a full hour. The Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim must be brought during the afternoon hours of the day, and the earliest it can be brought is when the sun has clearly begun to move to the west, which is half an hour after noon, which would be 6.5 hours after sunrise. Generally, it's brought later than that to allow time for all the korbanos of the day to be brought before it. But B'arvei Psachim nishchat b'sheva mechza v'kar b'shmoino mechza. In Erev Pesach, when more time was needed in order to bring the Korban Pesach after the Korban Tamid, the Tamid was shechted at 7.5 hours and brought on the Mizbeach at 8.5 hours. The Korban Pesach had to be brought after the Tamid, but before Shkia. Since every Yid had to be part of the Korban Pesach, the Kehanim needed enough time to bring the Korban. Since everyone had to be part of the Korban Pesach, the Kehanim needed enough time to bring a great number of Korbanos before Shkia, before sunset, and they therefore brought the Tamid earlier than usual. And Bein B'Choil, Bein B'Shabbos. The Tamid was brought at these times both on weekdays and on Shabbos. Although less time was needed on Shabbos because there were no Korbanos Yochid, the weekday schedule was kept in order to avoid confusion. After the Korban Pesach was brought in the Beis Hamikdash, the meat was brought to the place in Yerushalayim where it would be eaten and where it was roasted, which also has a lot of very specific halachas. When Erev Pesach fell on Erev Shabbos, it had to be roasted before Shabbos. When Pesach was on weekday, it could be roasted even after dark, since food can be cooked in Yom Tov, especially what you're going to be eating then. On Shabbos, however, roasting may not be done, as we'll discuss at the beginning of the next parak. So to allow time to roast the Korban Pesach before nightfall, it was shechted earlier than usual. So Chol Erev Pesach, Lias Erev Shabbos, and Erev Pesach fell out on Friday. Nishchat b'sheishu mechza v'karv b'shevo mechza. The Tamid was shechted at 6.5 hours and brought on the Mizbeach after 7.5 hours. When Erev Pesach is Friday, the Korban Tamid is brought as early as possible, which we said was the earliest you could bring it is 6.5 hours into the day, which would be a half hour after Chatzos. Nishchat b'sheishu mechza v'karv b'shevo mechza Pesach acharav. And in all cases, the Korban Pesach was brought after the Korban Tamid. Okay. Right. Mishnah Beis. Ha Pesach sheshachta shaloi l'shmoi v'kibo v'hilech v'zarek shaloi l'shmoi this is not a tongue twister. Let's try to understand what the Mishnah is saying. Just a shtickle hakdama, which we sort of mentioned in the a hakdama to the parak that the main part of a carbon is the avoid of the dam, the procedure of collecting the animal's blood and throwing it on the mizbeach. This consists of 4 avoidas: shechting the animal, kabbalah, receiving his blood in a klishares, bringing the blood to the mizbeach, which is halacha, and zrika is throwing it or placing it on the wall of the mizbeach. Although other avodas are also done when bringing a carbon, for example, certain parts that are burnt on the mizbeach and the meat that's usually eaten, it's only the blood service, the avodas hadam, which is essential. If part of this procedure is missing or done incorrectly, the carbon is no good. While the other avodas are important, it's the mitzvah and it's not ma'akev. The carbon is valid even if they're not done correctly. These avodas must be done for the sake of the correct carbon. If the kohen should have in mind to do them for a different carbon, for example, if he brings an oila and has in mind during these 4 avodas that it should be for a shlamim, the quality of the carbon is affected, and as we mentioned in the Hakdama, different carbonos are affected in different ways. The Mishnah teaches halacha for Korban Pesach, whose ikar avodas, who one of the dalet ikar avodah was performed for the sake, l'shem, a different carbon. So Pesach sheshachta shalei l'shmai, a Korban Pesach that a person shechted not for its own sake, but he had an intention that it should be for a different carbon. V'kibel v'hilech v'zarek shalei l'shmai, or if he was mekabel the dam in a klishares, he brought the dam to the mizbeach, or he threw it on the mizbeach shalei l'shmai, not for a carbon Pesach, or l'shmai v'shalei l'shmai, or he began one of these avodas l'shem, the carbon Pesach, and continued the same avodah l'shem, a different carbon, meaning he changed his intention during the avodah. Or if he did the reverse, he began one of these avodas not l'shem the Pesach, and then he continued l'shem a Pesach. Possible in each of these cases, whether he performs one avodah or even just part of one avodah for l'shem another carbon, the Pesach is no good. Even though he performed the rest of the avodas with the proper kavanos, it's already no good. It's already possible, and you can't make it up. It's done. What's an example of beginning an avodah for its own sake and continuing it not for its own sake? L'shem Pesach l'shem shlamim. He began the avodah for the sake of the Pesach and continued it for the sake of a carbon shlamim. The same would apply if he had any other carbon in mind. The Mishnah gives this example of a shlamim to teach that although the Moiser HaPesach is used as a shlamim, the Pesach that's brought in Erev Pesach for the sake of a shlamim is considered l'shem something else, and it's no good. Shalei l'shmai v'l'shmai. What's an example of starting an avodah not l'shem that carbon and continuing for its own? For l'shem, it's and continuing it l'shma. L'shem shlamim, l'shem Pesach. He began the avodah l'shem shlamim and continued it l'shem Pesach. Okay, Mishnah Gimel. Now we discussed in the Hakdama to this parak that Hagam, there are a lot of halachas in Kachim, but there are many specific in the world of Lishma. There's a lot more halachas that are specific to the Korban Pesach. So this Mishnah is going to be talking about that. If the Mishnah discusses the other intentions that would pass the Korban Pesach, in order to be mekayim the mitzvah of Pesach properly, a person had to register for a specific Korban Pesach before it was shechted. He has to become part of a chabura. He does this by joining a group that brings a Korban Pesach and he eats it together with them. Only people who are registered for this specific carbon may eat from it. The Mishnah teaches the halacha for Korban Pesach that was shechted with the kavana that it be for people who didn't register for it, or for people who otherwise cannot eat it. If you shechted Korban Pesach with the intention that it be for those who are not able to eat it, for example, people are too sick or too weak to eat it, meaning he had in mind that the carbon should be for members of the group who were nimna on it, who were registered for it. However, they're all too sick, too elderly, or too weak to eat a piece of meat the size of an olive, which is a kazayas, the minimum amount required to fulfill the mitzvah of eating Korban Pesach. The Gemara says stories about how there were times when a chabura was so big that people barely just got by with a kazayas. It's not such a big animal, but to sit down and eat a whole sheep, it is, it's a little bit. It's not so little. It's a little more than that. Or v'shalelim nuyav. Or for those who were not registered for it, he had in mind that the carbon should be for a different group rather than the one that was registered for it. So let's say a person, so the 8th parak, the Mishnayos, the Gemara discusses what's the halacha if a person gets registered and he double dips, he gets registered in 2 carbonos, what's the halacha over there? For people who do not have a bris milah, or for people who are tamei, who are not allowed to eat a korban pesach, pasul, the korban pesach is no good. What's this? The Torah asks a person, and Arel is not somebody who can eat. That's what the pasuk says. That an Arel is not allowed to eat in the korban pesach. Now we're not talking about a mummal arelus, meaning we're not talking about a person who just didn't want to have a bris. We're talking about a yid whose brothers died because of a milah. So we don't give him a bris milah. He doesn't get a bris milah because we don't want him to die. So he's still possible from eating korban pesach. And a person who's tamei is also also to eat kachim, and he gets karis if he eats it. That's the halacha. So shechting a pesach for such a person is the same as shechting it for a person who's not able to eat it, and it's going to be possible. Why? Because the Torah says that he and his neighbor who's near his house shall take according to the number of people. Everyone according to what he eats shall be counted for the lamb or kid. They shall shecht it. The Chacham learned from these psukim that the Pesach must be shechted for people who were numbered, meaning that they were registered for it before they shechted it, and number two, they're able to eat from it. The Mishnah speaks just of shechting the korban pesach for those who are physically not able to eat it, meaning shalei la'ichlav, because this kavana would pass the korban only during the shechita. However, the kavana that it be for shalei l'mnuyav passes the korban even if the kohen has this intention during any of the dalet avodas that make up for the avodas hadam, as we mentioned in the previous Mishnah. La'ichlav shalei la'ichlav. However, if he shechted it for those who are able to eat it and for those who are not able to eat it, meaning for a group consisting of healthy people and not healthy people, limnuyav v'shaloi limnuyav, for those that are registered for it and those also that are not registered for it, limulim la'reilim, for circumcised people and for uncircumcised people, l'tamei mulatahirim, or for people who are tamei and for people that are tahar, kosher, it's good. As long as it's shechted for those registered and able to eat it, is valid even if it's shechted for the disqualified people as well. The reason for this is dafka in the case of our Mishnah, but not in the case of the previous Mishnah, is that the improper intentions, the improper kavana of the previous Mishnah relate to the korban itself. The korban pesach wasn't offered for the sake of the correct korban. This is more chomer. However, in our Mishnah, this psul, this issue, we should say it's not possible. This issue, this disqualification relates to something outside the actual korban, but it's about the people that will eat it. Now, you don't have this by other karbanos, because by other karbanos, it's not necessarily a problem if they don't eat it as much as it is by the korban pesach. This invalidation is less serious and invalidates the korban only if it was intended solely for the wrong people. We learned in Mishnah Aleph that the korban pesach was brought on the afternoon of Erev Pesach, after the Talmud Shel Beinu Arbaim. The Mishnah now discusses the halacha of a korban pesach that was brought too early that day. If a person shechted it before noon, kaidem chatzos is the halfway point between the day and the night, it's no good. Mishum shenemar beinu arbaim, because the pasuk says the people, the congregation, should shechted beinu arbaim. Shechted kaidem letamid kosher. If you shechted it afternoon, but before the afternoon tamid, it's still good. Except that somebody should continue to stir the blood of the korban pesach until the blood of the tamid is thrown on the mizbeach, and only then throw the blood of the korban pesach onto the mizbeach. Now, why is that? Ideally, all avodas of the tamid should be done before those of the korban pesach. Therefore, even when the korban pesach was incorrectly shechted before the tamid, we should still try at least to do the avodah of throwing the blood of the tamid before that of the korban pesach. In this case, while waiting for the blood of the korban tamid to have zrika, the blood of the pesach must be stirred so it doesn't congeal and become unfit to do zrika on the mizbeach. V'im nizrak kosher. However, if blood of the pesach was thrown on the mizbeach before the tamid, the korban pesach is still good. This would be more of a kachim diga halacha as opposed to a achila diga halacha, as we mentioned previously in the Mishnah. Just stam a thought they talk about this. That's very interesting, because by the chlal, Shabbos and Yom Tov are supposed to have guests. Chazal speak out that in Yom Tov there's more of an inyan to have guests. But it's interesting is that on Pesach we say halach ma'anya and we invite people. So part of it is we're saying it in Lashon Arami because that was a language that was spoken in Bavel, that was in the Golus, that the people were able to invite you now, because normally we wouldn't be able to invite you because you have to be nimna in the korban Pesach beforehand. So now that we're in Galus and we don't have a Korban Pesach, then now we do allow you to come and join us for the Seder. Right? I think I heard this from the Rishiva of Jenison, so it's all goes on time. Mishnah Dal, Hasheichet es ha-Pesach al ha-Chometz over below Saseh. The Torah tells us, Le'sishchat al Chometz dam zivchi, shall not slaughter the blood of my offering upon Chometz. This forbids a person to shech the Korban Pesach while there is Chometz in his possession, or in the possession of anyone in the group bringing the Korban Pesach. The Mishnah brings a machlekes about the details of this Isser. We learned in the Mishnah in Parak Aleph that a person is required to move all chametz from his rishus in the morning of Erev Pesach. In addition, there is a separate Isser to shech the Korban Pesach while still in the possession of chametz. This Isser applies even if the chametz is not actually with him in the Beis HaMikdash when he shechs the Korban, even if he has it at home. The pasuk of L'sishchat al chametz dam zivchi should be understood to mean you shall not shecht or throw the dam of the Korban. So Hasheichet es ha-Pesach al chametz over below Saseh. One who shechts the Pesach while there's still chametz in his rishus, or in the rishus of anyone in the group bringing the Korban Pesach, he's over on this Isser of L'sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Although the pasuk simply says zivchi, which does not specify which Korban, the pasuk continues v'lo yolin laboikar zevach chag ha-Pesach. Nor may the feast offering of the Pesach festival be left overnight until morning. Since the end of the pasuk discusses the Korban Pesach, the Chachamim teach that the unspecified Korban mentioned in the beginning of the pasuk also refers to the Korban Pesach. Although the Sheichet is over the Isser, the Korban is good. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Afatam. Rabbi Yehuda says that one also is over this Isser by shechting the Tamish Albein Arbaim and Erev Pesach while still having chametz in his rishos. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the fact that the pasuk refers to the Korban Pesach by the general term zivchi, it indicates that it includes another Korban, not just the Korban Pesach, but which is the Tamid, because the Korban Tamid is called as Korbani Lachmi, my offering my food, which would be like my Korban as well. Reb Shimon Aimer, HaPesach bar ba'osa l'shmoi chayiv, sheloi l'shmoi parta. The next Tana holds that a person can be chayiv for shechting Korban Pesach while owning chametz, only if the Korban Pesach that he shechted is a good Korban. Meaning, if the Korban would be no good, then he wouldn't be able to be over on this Isser. If a person shechts the Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach, l'shma, while owning chametz, he's going to be over this Isser. But if he shechted shaloi l'shma, he's not going to be chayiv. He's not going to be chayiv. He's not going to be over on this Isser. Since shechting Korban Pesach l'shma, l'shem, a different Korban, makes the Korban Pesach no good, Reb Shimon doesn't consider this to halachically be considered an act of shchita. Therefore, a person who does so does not transgress the Isser of shechting Korban Pesach while owning chametz. According to Reb Shimon, only an act of shchita that makes the basar of the animal fit to eat is considered an act of shchita min haTorah. Since the meat of a Korban may not be eaten, of a Korban that's no good cannot be eaten, when you shecht it, it's not considered an act of shchita because shchita she'eina ruya lo yishma shchita. Ushar kol azvachim bein l'shmon bein shalei l'shmon poter. Reb Shimon now discusses the halacha for other types of karbanos when shechted in Erev Pesach while still owning chametz. Reb Shimon learns out from another pasuk that during the time when chametz is aser, it's forbidden to shecht any korban while possessing chametz. However, Erev Pesach is an exception to the rule, as we'll see right now. However, in regard to all other karbanos that a person shechts on the afternoon of Erev Pesach while owning chametz, whether he shechts them l'shma or whether he shechts them shalei l'shma, he's parted because in Erev Pesach the Isser to shecht while having chametz in one rishos applies only to the Korban Pesach. In addition to the pasuk mentioned in the introduction to the Mishnah, the Torah also repeats the Isser of l'sizbach al chametz dam zivchi. That pasuk makes no mention of the Korban Pesach at all. So Reb Shimon understands it to mean that it includes all karbanos, and he also infers from the fact that the Torah states two psukim, one that specifies the Korban Pesach and one that does not specify the Korban Pesach, that the two psukim do not describe identical isurim. The first pasuk that mentions the Korban Pesach applies during the time that the Korban Pesach is shechted, which would mean Erev Pesach in the afternoon, and that Isser applies only to the Korban Pesach. This pasuk that does not mention the Korban Pesach applies when it is no longer the time for shechting the Pesach, but chametz is still aser, meaning any time throughout Chag HaPesach. That Isser applies to all karbanos, as the Mishnah will continue to explain. Uba mayid l'shmoi pater, shalei l'shmoi chayiv. According to Reb Shimon, the opposite is true during Pesach, as he now explains. According to Reb Shimon, the Isser against shechting while in possession of chametz applies in Erev Pesach only to a Korban Pesach, and only if it's shechted l'shma. but it does not apply to any other karbanos at all. Reb Shimon will now teach that the opposite is true during Pesach. The Isser applies to all karbanos, and only to the Korban Pesach if we're shechted to be Shalai Lishma and not Lishma. Ubamay Lishma Potter. During the Yantif of Pesach, if a person with chametz in his reshus shechted a Korban Pesach Lishma, he's parted from this Isser of Lashishcha Tal Chametz Dam Zivchi because it's not a good korban. He wasn't over on the Isser of shechting while owning chametz. He is, however, chayev for owning chametz on Pesach. A Korban Pesach can be made only on Erev Pesach, so if he made it any other time, it's no good. However, if he shechts it during the Yantif, not Lishma, but for L'Shem Shlamim, he's going to be chayev, because in that case, it would be considered a good Shlamim. A Korban Pesach that wasn't brought on Erev Pesach can be brought later as a regular Korban Shlamim. However, it is valid as a Shlamim only if it wasn't offered with the Kavanah that it be a Korban Pesach. It doesn't need to be offered specifically as a Shlamim, and intention for anything other than a Pesach will make it good enough to be considered a Shlamim. Ushar kol hazvachim, bein l'shman, bein shalei l'shman chayiv, and all other karbanos that a person shechts on Pesach while he has chametz in his reshus, whether he shechts them for their own sake or not for their own sake, he's chayiv for being over on this Isser, because all other karbanos are kosher and are good, even if they're not done l'shma. Chutz min achatas sheshochet shalei l'shma, except for achatas that were shechted shalei l'shma, which is no good. Although all karbanos must be made l'shma, only the Korban Pesach and the achatas are completely puzzle if made for the sake of different karbanos, as the Mishnah says in the beginning of Zvachim, chutz min achatas min ha-Pesach. Therefore, one is not chayiv for shechting achatas in such a manner during Pesach while owning chametz. Bekitzer, the Tanna Kama holds that the Isser of shechting a korban while he has chametz applies only to the Korban Pesach. Rabbi Yehuda holds that it applies both to the Korban Pesach and to the Tam Shel Ben Arabayim on Erev Pesach. Reb Shimon says three different halachas. Number one, a person is chayiv for being over on this Isser only if the korban that he shechted is a good korban. Number two, this Isser applies to all karbanos throughout the Yantif of Pesach. Number three, however, on Erev Pesach it applies only to the Korban Pesach and not to any of the other karbanos. Okay. Mishnah Hey Weiter. HaPesach nishrat b'sholish kitos. The Pesach was shechted in three groups. Shenama b'shochtu oisoi kol kahal adas Yisrael. The Pasuk says the entire assembly of the congregation of Klal Yisrael shall shech the Korban Pesach. Kahal ve'eda v'Yisrael. The Pasuk mentions three terms that imply groups. The Kahal, which could be an assembly, an Eda, congregation, Yisrael, Israel. The Chacham will learn from this that the Korban Pesach should be shechted in three groups. Therefore, even if only a small number of people come to bring their Korbanos, so it's possible to do all of them at the same time, they're nevertheless divided into three groups. Nichnas hakata rishayna, nismalas ha'azara, na'alu dalsis ha'azara, taku heriu v'taku. The first group entered the Beis HaMikdash, entered the Chatzar until the Chatzar was full, and then they closed the doors of the Chatzar. They did this to avoid overcrowding. To ensure that there would be three groups, they closed the gates so that people didn't try to push their way into the first group and leave no one for the later ones. Just imagine what the Shamanim and all these Askunim were doing then also. Taku hiriu v'taku, during the Avodah, the Kehanim would blow Tkiya Trua and Tkiya on the Chatzaitres. It wasn't a shofar, it was with Chatzaitres. We'll learn later in Mishnah Zayin that Hallel was read when the Korban Pesach was brought, and as the Hallel was read, the Kehanim blew trumpets. These sounded the same as those blown by a shofar in Rosh Hashanah, Tashrat, Chulu, I guess was part of the musical accompaniment of the Hallel of, part of the matzav at least, of the Hallel of Erev Pesach. HaKehanim aimdim shurai to be yedayim beziche kesef ubeziche zahav. For regular karbanos, a single kohen is makabel the dam in a klishares and brings it to the mizbeach. For the Korban Pesach, the Kehanim used a different procedure. The Mishnah tells us how they prepared to shecht. The Kehanim stood in rows that stretched from the place where the animals were shechted until the mizbeach, and in their hands were silver bowls and gold bowls, which they would use to bring the blood of the korban to the mizbeach. Shura shekula kesef, kesef is shura shekula zahav, zahav. A row that was all Kehanim with silver bowls, and one row was all Kehanim with gold bowls. They did not mix the silver and gold bowls in the same row, because a complete row of one type looks much nicer. By making the rows as aesthetically pleasing as possible, we show respect for, it was a Kved HaMikdash, and it was a cover for the korban, it was a cover for the mitzvah, it was a cover for Klal Yisrael, and they tried to pump it up as much as they could. But The bowls did not have wide bases, but pointed bottoms, because if they had wide bases, the kohen might put them down on the ground, and the blood would congeal and become unfit to throw on the mizbeach. Since the kohanim were occupied with a tremendous amount of karbanos at the same time, there was a chash that a kohen might put down a bowl with dam and forget about it, which would cause the blood to congeal. Therefore, they used bowls with pointy bottoms, which could not be put down. It's an interesting thing. But we know in our times that Erev Pesach is a hectic, busy day. Shtel Zechva, what it looked like in the times of the Beis HaMikdash when everyone had to bring the Korban Pesach and everyone was running around with the Karbanos. Right? And we know Kehanim is Rizim Heim. It's a very interesting thing that comes to mind. Rav Hutton is Maimer, Bez Rizos Silgabe Korban Pesach, the Chometz and the Matzah. But we know that Chabura, B'nei Chabura is Rizim Heim, the Gemara says in a few places. And we also know that Kehanim is Rizim Heim. Also, B'nei Ger Korban Pesach. So there's a lot of Zrizos that was going on. Zrizos doesn't necessarily mean doing something quickly. Zrizos means doing something, getting it done, doing it right, doing it with a certain energy, doing it with alacrity, doing it with a chiyus. Mishnah Vav. Shochet Yisrael v'kibul hakaya. Noisna l'chaveroi v'chaveroi l'chaveroi makabelas hamalei u'machzes hareikon. A Yisrael, someone who's not a kohen, reshech the korban pesach if he wished, because any korban can be resheched by anyone. The kibul hakayin, and the kayin at the head of one of the rows that stretched to the mizbeach would be makabel the dam in a bowl. Although most avodas in the korban pesach may be done only by a kayin, the korbanos may be shechted by a Yisrael. However, the blood must be received in a bowl by a kayin because all the avodas of a korban after shchita must be done by a kayin. Not that shchita is not an avoda. Shchita is an avoda, but it's kshera bizar b'chol hakorbanos, to quote the Rav. He would give the bowl to his fellow kohen, and the kohen standing next to him in the row, and his fellow kohen would pass it next to the guy next to him, and so on, until it would reach the kohen at the end of the row next to the mizbeach. Each kohen would accept a full bowl of dam from the kohen standing next to him on one side, and return an empty bowl that he would give to the kohen standing to his other side. Every bowl was passed down a row until it reached the kohen closest to the mizbeach, who would then be zervik the dam. He would then pass back the empty bowl to the kohen next to him, who would in turn pass it along the row until it was returned to the kohen next to the shchita. The kehanim were thus involved in two activities: passing full bowls of dam to the mizbeach, and passing back empty bowls. Each kohen must first accept the full bowl that he's handed, and only then pass back the empty bowl. This is because in mavirin ala mitzvahs, we do not pass over the opportunity to do mitzvahs, which teaches one must do a mitzvah that comes his way before any other activity. Since accepting the full bowl is the fulfillment of the mitzvah of halacha, which is bringing the dam to the mizbeach, it must be done before passing back the empty bowl, which is only a hachana for the mitzvah. I guess the people that were into the hachana of the mitzvah would be more busy with that, but agapanam, this is the halacha. The reason that so many kahanim were used to pass the blood to the mizbeach was to show added respect for the mitzvah, because B'Rav Om Hadras Melech, the glory of the king, is demonstrated by the multitudes, and as we mentioned before, we wanted to be Bechlal in Beis HaMikdash. They tried to make a matzav out of everything, but by the Korban Pesach Befrat, tried to make a very big matzav out of it, because all of Klal Yisrael was coming together, say Hallel together, the Karbanos together, Yom Tov together. It was a very special time. The kohen who's nearest to the mizbeach would then throw the dam once onto the wall of the mizbeach at a spot opposite the base of the mizbeach, opposite the yesod. The base of the mizbeach was a low platform that ran along two sides of the mizbeach and extended only one amma along the other two sides. The Mishnah teaches that the dam of the Korban Pesach was thrown on part of the walls of the mizbeach that was above the yesod, so that the blood will flow down to the side of the mizbeach onto the yesod. Mishnah Zayin. When they finished bringing the carbon, when the first group finished bringing the carbon, the first group left the chotzer of the Beis HaMikdash, and the second group entered, and they would do the whole thing over again. Just remember, the Kehanim also have to bring their own Korban Pesach. When the second group left, the third group entered and made their karbanos. The procedure of the second and third group was just like the procedure of the first group, which was described in the previous Mishnayos. Karu as a halal, they said halal, while each group shechted the karbanos. The Levim recited halal, gamru shanu, If they finished halal before the group finished shechting the karbonis, they repeated it. V'im shonu shilshu, and if they finished repeating it, when they finished repeating it, the group that kat still didn't finish it, they recited it a third time. Although this was the halacha, they never actually recited it a third time. Which literally means they did not read it 3 times in all their days, because there were many kehanim performing the avodas, and they worked very quickly with very systemized way. So there was never a reason to sing Hallel a third time for any of the groups. Rabbi Yehuda says, the third group never even reached the passage of Hallel that begins Ahavti Kishma Hashem, I love for Hashem hears, which is the 5th paragraph of Hallel in the first recitation of Bnei Amma Muwatim, because the third group had only a few people, and therefore they finished relatively quickly. Most people would try to be in the first or second groups, in keeping with the teaching of Zriza Makdim and Lemitzvahs. The conscientious people about the mitzvahs hurried to do the mitzvahs, so only a few people were left for the third group. It could be that there was reason and just something happened, but then they slammed the door on them, so then they couldn't get in. Pesach Ma'uben, Pesach Ma'uchim. We know that the Gemara says a story that there was a lot of people, and people got trampled on, people got snatched, because it was very hectic, it was a very busy situation then. Mishnah Ches, Kemaseu B'Choil, Kach Maseu B'Shabbos. The procedure of the Korban Pesach followed on the weekdays, which was described in the previous Mishnayos, was also followed when Erev Pesach was on Shabbos. However, certain activities related to the Korban Pesach that were not mentioned in the previous Mishnayos were done during the week, but not on Shabbos, as we'll see later on in the Masechta. However, the Kehanim would rinse the floor of the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos after they finished bringing the Korban Pesach. A canal of running water flowed through the Chatzar of the Beis HaMikdash and exited through an opening in the wall. To clean the marble floor of the Azara from the blood of the Karbanos, the Kehanim would block the opening that let out the water, causing the canal to back up and flood the floor. They would then unstop the opening, and the water would flow out and carry away the blood. They would do this in Erev Pesach to wash away all the blood that accumulated from the many Karbanos that were brought throughout the day. There's a story that Rabbi Chaim Zanenfeld met Rav Kook, and it was right before Pesach, and he gave him a bracha. Rabbi Chaim gave him a bracha that he should walk up to his ankles in blood. So people there was like, what are you talking about? They got nervous. What was happening? He says, no, I'm pinching him on. I'm giving him a bracha that he should be zeicha we should all be zeicha to bring the Korban Pesach. Rav Kook was a Gevena Kain, and Mamela, he should be able to, there was a lot of dam in the ad arkuva yisayin bedam. It was up to the arkuva, whether that means the ankle or a little higher up, but that was the story. Now, what was the problem? Why was the shalebrit and chachamim? The Chachamim answered washing or sweeping a floor on Shabbos because it may be mashve gumas, which is aser midiraisa. The Kehanim nevertheless cleaned the floor of the Beis HaMikdash. As a rule, there was no shvus b'Hamikdash. There were no many rabbanons that are normally aser outside the Beis HaMikdash are allowed in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. The Chachamim, however, were not pleased with this because restrictions are lifted in the Beis HaMikdash only when it's necessary for the avodah. Rinsing the floor after the avodah is not necessary for the avodah and is therefore aser. The issue to wash the sweep floors applies only in times and places where most people have dirt floors, and not to non-dirt floors nowadays when most floors are covered with wood or material. So nowadays you are allowed to sweep the floor. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kais Hayim Mamali Medamet Haruvis Zarka Zrika Achas Al Mizbech Lahid Lechachamim. This is a machlekes that's unrelated to Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda says that after the Kehanim finished throwing the dam of all the psachim, a kohen would fill up a cup from the intermingled dam from all the karbanos that had accumulated on the floor, and he would throw it once on the al-gabe ha-mizbeach, onto the wall of the mizbeach, in the event and in the rush to bring the karbanos, the blood of any carbon that spilled. There was a lot going on, so it could be something spilled and it hadn't been thrown in the mizbeach properly, it would now be thrown as part of this cup, which contains blood from all the karbanos of that day. Since blood is a liquid substance, we assume that in any area in which it is contained, it all mixes together evenly. So a cup of blood from the floor is assumed to contain at least a drop of blood from every animal whose blood spilled there. As I state in Rashi and Zvachim. It's a Shaila had to figure out this in the alumnus of it, but that's what Rashi says. The Chachamim did not agree with Reb Yehuda, because according to the Chachamim, this should not be done, because the Dama Taruvis from the floor is not fit for throwing it on the Mizbeach. Why not? So let's explain a little bit about how Dam Kachim works. Really mostly based on the Gemara. The Chachamim hold that the dam on the floor cannot be used to do zrika for the following reason. The blood that has to be thrown on the Mizbeach is dam sha'hanefesh yotzei. It's the blood that spurts from the animal's neck as soon as it's shechted. Most of the lifeblood from the Korban Pesach was niskabel in the Kli Shares, and was thrown on the Mizbeach. Consequently, the majority of blood on the floor is blood that drains from the animals after the initial spurts stopped, which is called damatamtzis. This blood is unfit for throwing on the Mizbeach. The Chachamim therefore apply the principle of bittul b'raiv, which means nullification by the majority, which says that when you have two substances mixed together, the majority substance cancels out the minority substance. So the small amount of dam nefesh is going to be in this battle. It's going to be canceled out by the larger amount of dam tamtis that's on the floor. Memela, it's not fit to be thrown on the Mizbeach. Rabbi Yehuda, though, holds that the reason why we don't say bittul b'raiv over here is because it's min b'minai. It's two of the same substances. So therefore, one type of blood cannot cancel out another type of blood. Whatever lifeblood is on the floor, it retains its identity of dam nefesh and can then be thrown on the Mizbeach. Okay, Mishnah Tes. After Ketzat Tailun Mafshitin, how do they hang the offerings, the karbonos, and skin them? Unkoloya shel barzal, iron hooks, hayu kvuim b'ksalim u'ba'amudim, were fixed in the walls of the chatzar and in the pillars that stood in the chatzar. Shebehen tailun mafshitin, that on these hooks they would hang the karbonos and skin them. And anyone who had no place to hang his karbonos and the skins, because the hooks were all occupied by other karbonos. They were thin, smooth sticks of wood there. They were thin, smooth sticks of wood there, and a person who would face his friend and rest one end of a stick on his shoulder and the other end on his friend's shoulder, and he would hang the carbon from it and from the stick and skin it. There was a section in the northern side of the Azara that was known as the Beis HaMitbachayim, and that's where the karbanos were shechted and the hide was removed. That area contained 8 short stone pillars topped with blocks of wood in which hooks were attached to. In addition, there were also hooks that were affixed to the walls of the Chatzar, the Azara, in that area also, so that everybody could have room to do their skinning, the Hafshatas HaKarbon. So Mamel, there weren't always enough hooks for everyone to do it. But I guess they would always have enough sticks. I would imagine that they were like long, like those long matzah sticks that they used to roll out the dough. Obviously a little longer than that because, how it would stay, I guess they would tie it up somehow that it shouldn't fall off. Rabbi Lezer says, if Erev Pesach fell out on Shabbos when the sticks could not be used because they were muktzah, since the sticks were designated to be used for skinning animals, which is an activity that's normally asur on Shabbos, they're muktzah and could not be moved. However, the Tanna Kama holds that the sticks may be used even on Shabbos because muktzah is only midrabbanon, and the isurim derabbanon on Shabbos do not apply in the Beis Hamikdash because ein shvus b'Hamikdash. So how would they do it on Shabbos? According to Rabbi Lezer, Maniach yad al ketzav chaverev yad chaveri al kseifa. A person who could not find an available hook would place his hand on his friend's shoulder, and his friend would place a hand on his shoulder, and they would hang the carbon from their arms and skin it. 2 people would face each other, and each would rest his left hand on the other's right shoulder, and they would suspend the carbon from their arms and use their free right hands to skin it. Okay, Mishnah Yud. Karai v'hoitzi emurav. After the carbon was skinned, the owner, the bailam, or whoever was doing it, tore open its abdomen and removed the fats and the organs that are burnt on the mizbeach. Certain fats, the kidneys, the diaphragm, along with part of the liver, and when the offering was a sheep, the fat tail, are all burned on the mizbeach, and these parts are known as the emurim. Nosna b'moges v'hiktirin al gabe mizbeach. He put them in a bowl, a big bowl where they would collect the meat in order for a kohen to take them and burn them on the mizbeach. The act of the hafshata and removing the emurim do not need to be done by a kohen, and were usually done by the owner, since the kehanim were occupied with other parts of the avodah. However, putting the emurim on the mizbeach must be done by a kohen. What's going on? When each of the 3 groups finished making their karbonos, everyone would take the meat of their carbon to the place in Yerushalayim and they would roast it here. The Mishnah describes what was done on Erev Pesach, that was on Shabbos, when they could not carry the meat home because of the issur to carry outside on Shabbos. So when Erev Pesach was on Shabbos, the first group left the Azara, and after making their carbon, and sat on the Harabayas outside the Beis Hamikdash and the Chutz and the Azara. The Harabayas was surrounded by a wall and was considered Rosh Hashanah, where one is allowed to carry. The second group, after finishing the offering, left the Azara and sat in the Chel. The Chel was an area that stretched 10 amas to the outer walls of the Ezras Nashim and was surrounded by a low partition called the Sereg, which was mashed down by the Avonim, as we know. V'hashlishis b'mkaima imedas, and the third group, after finishing their karbanos, stood in place in the Chatzar. Chashcha yotzu v'tzalu es Peschain. When it grew dark and Shabbos ended, all three groups left and rose to the Korban Pesach. While the first two groups were allowed to sit, the third group, which remained in the main Azara, had to remain standing because no one's allowed to sit in the Azara except for Malchus Beis David. And let's hope that this coming Pesach will be zeicha to do the avodah of the V'nei Chal and Psachim and Azvachim, and we should be zeicha to the Malchus Beis David. Wie es dar zu sein, Mashiach zit kein Meher wie ein Mein.